A piece of music has a chord progression and a melody. The melody and chord progression depend on one another. The melody is made up of notes that belong to the chord. For instance, if the chord is a C major triad, we can have a melody with C's, E's, and G's. These notes are called chord tones because they are tones that belong to the chord. But not all melody notes are chord tones. Sometimes a melody contains what we call non-chord tones. Non-chord tones can make a melody much more interesting than one with only chord tones, but a melody can't just have any random note with no regard for the chord progression. Rather, every non-chord tone is anchored to a chord tone a step away. There are two main types of non-chord tones: neighboring tones and passing tones. A neighboring tone occurs when a chord tone moves to a note a step away and then right back. So you could take the note C and make the figure CDC or CBC. The D and B are neighboring tones a step away from the chord tone C. A passing tone connects two different chord tones by filling in the space with a scale. So you could go from C up to E by putting a D in between, or downward from C to G by putting B and A in between. Note that neighboring and passing tones are both approached and left by step. Let's look at this short excerpt from Beethoven's Third Piano Sonata. The first four measures give us the chord progression 1, 5, 5, 7, 1 in the key of C major. In the first measure, which is all over the one chord, the melody has E, D, E, D, E, F, E. E is a chord tone of the C major chord, but D and F are not. These Ds and Fs are neighboring tones. The alto line has a similar neighboring tone figure decorating the chord tone C. In measure 2, all notes are chord tones of the G major chord. In measure 3, the chord changes to a G dominant seventh chord, so F is a chord tone and E and G are neighboring tones. Well, actually the G is technically a chord tone, but here it acts just like a neighboring tone, given that this measure is basically the same as measure 1. To analyze a melody's use of chord tones and non-chord tones, we are going to use a technique called stem and slur analysis. In stem and slur analysis, you are going to write all of the melody's notes as black note heads, regardless of the actual rhythm. Then you'll give all of the chord tones stems, so they look like quarter notes, and you'll leave the non-chord tones unstemmed. Again, this has nothing to do with rhythm. So in the first measure of the Beethoven, all of the E's get stems, and the other notes do not. Finally, you're going to add a slur from the first chord tone to the next, encompassing the neighboring tone in between. What this does is shows that the three notes E, D, E combine to make a single figure, in this case, a neighboring figure. You'll do the same for the other neighboring tones, and so on for the rest of this phrase. Finally, put one bass note per chord in the lower staff and add the Roman numerals. Now what you have is a picture of the main melodic notes and how they are embellished with non-chord tones. The next step is to provide a simplified version of the original piece, now reduced down to its basic counterpoint. This is called a contrapuntal reduction. In a contrapuntal reduction, all non-chord tones are removed and the soprano line traces just the basic melodic structure. So in our Beethoven example, we'll just put an E for the first measure, then a D, then F, then back to E. The bass line is just the original bass line, but we'll take out the rests and the repeated notes. C, G, G, C. As is the case here, your reduction will often look like first species counterpoint with one soprano note per bass note. Here's what the reduction sounds like. Compare that to the original. See how they sound similar? Passing tones get the same treatment. Here you'll have two different chord tones filled in stepwise with non-chord tones. You'll slur the first chord tone to the second, encompassing the passing tones in between. Let's look at passing tones in Beethoven's famous Ode to Joy melody. The first 8 bars simply alternate root position 1 and 5 chords in the key of D major.
Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum.
When there's a 1 chord, D, F sharp, and A are chord tones, and when there's a 5 chord, it's A, C sharp, and E. The melody has plenty of non-chord tones, most of which are passing tones. So we'll stem the chord tones and slur the passing tones between them. For our reduction, we'll take out all the non-chord tones and simplify the rhythm. We notice that we get 2 melody notes per bass note, which looks more like second species counterpoint. Here's what the reduction sounds like. Again, notice how it sounds just like a less cool version of the original.
Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium,